A Marine came home, and his mother was gone. No signs of struggle, no goodbye, just a silent house, and a German shepherd that refused to leave the front porch. For 2 years, he searched across states, putting up flyers, chasing leads no one else cared about. There were moments he almost gave up, but the dog never did. It would stop, staring into the distance, like it was following something he couldn't see. Until one day, it didn't move at all. Not because the journey was over, but because the answer was finally right in front of them. Because sometimes people don't disappear, they just lose their way. And sometimes love is the only thing that never gives up. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. A pale mountain morning settled over Red Hollow, cold air threading through the pines and carrying a stillness that felt heavier than silence. Gavin Mercer eased his truck off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path leading to his childhood home, the tires crunching softly beneath him, as if the ground itself didn't want to make noise. He hadn't been back in years, not long enough to notice what had changed, not long enough to understand what absence could look like when it stayed too long in one place. This time was supposed to be different. He had come back with time in his hands, with the intention of staying long enough to fix something that had quietly worn down between him and the only person who had ever waited for him without asking questions. Gavin was 46, a former United States Marine built in the hard, efficient way of a man who had spent decades training his body to obey before his mind caught up. He stood just over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, his posture straight even when no one was watching. His face carried sharp, deliberate angles, a strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken once and healed without care for symmetry. His dark hair was cut short out of habit, streaked faintly with gray near the temples, and a rough layer of stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, a cold gray blue, held a constant alertness, the kind that never fully shut off, not even in quiet places like this. War had taught him to read silence. It had also taught him that silence was rarely harmless. He hadn't called his mother in nearly 3 weeks, and now that fact sat heavier than anything else as the house came into view at the end of the driveway. 3 weeks. The last time they spoke had been short, almost careless in the way ordinary conversations become when you assume there will be another one. She had sounded fine, maybe a little distracted, maybe a little quieter than usual, but nothing that had forced him to stop and ask more questions. She had told him to come home when he could. He had said he would. He had meant it. He just hadn't done it fast enough. Gavin cut the engine and sat still, hands resting on the wheel, listening. The silence came immediately, thick and unnatural, pressing in on him in a way that felt wrong. There should have been something, movement inside, a door shifting, the faint sound of someone alive in the house. Instead, there was nothing at all. He stepped out, boots pressing into gravel, his body already tightening in quiet preparation without him consciously deciding to do so. The house looked clean, almost too clean, the porch swept, the windows neat, everything in place in a way that didn't match the absence he was beginning to feel. He walked up the steps and pushed the door open, and the silence inside was complete, not empty but controlled, as if something had been removed without leaving a trace behind. No television murmuring, no kitchen noise, no scent of cooking, just cold air and stillness stretching across every room. Then something shifted in the hallway, and Gavin's body reacted instantly, shoulders tightening, breath slowing, his weight adjusting as if expecting something to move again. It was Coda. The German shepherd stood in the hallway, completely still, watching him. Coda was 5 years old, large and powerfully built with a deep chest and strong legs, his coat thick and layered, black along his back and shoulders, fading into a rich amber along his legs and chest. His ears stood upright, alert, and his amber-brown eyes held an intelligence that made him feel less like an animal and more like a witness to something he couldn't explain. Gavin had trained him himself before deployment, not for combat, but with the same discipline: commands, awareness, restraint. But more than that, Coda had belonged to his mother in a way that went beyond ownership. He had stayed with her, watched over her, understood her routines better than any person could. Now he didn't move. Coda? The dog's ears flicked at the sound of his name. He took one step forward, slow and cautious, then stopped. He didn't run to Gavin, didn't bark, didn't react the way he should have after weeks apart. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward the window, his body tightening as his gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. Gavin followed the movement without thinking, his eyes narrowing as he looked out toward the northern tree line where the forest stretched dense and dark, swallowing light and distance at the same time. Coda looked back at him, then back at the trees. Something inside Gavin shifted, subtle but immediate, the kind of instinct he had learned not to ignore. "Where is she?" he asked quietly, more to himself than the dog. Coda moved then, pacing once across the floor, restless, his breathing slightly heavier, his body tense in a way that didn't match confusion but memory. Gavin moved through the house quickly after that, checking each room with growing unease. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, each one confirming the same thing. Nothing broken, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. Just absence. No note. No sign of struggle, no explanation. When he stepped back outside, the air felt colder than before. A screen door creaked open next door. "Gavin?" He turned, already knowing the voice. Martha Bell stood on her porch, thin and slightly bent at the shoulders, her gray hair tied loosely behind her head. She was in her late 60s, with a narrow face and sharp eyes that had spent decades watching the same stretch of road. Martha was the kind of woman who noticed everything but spoke carefully, weighing each word before letting it go. "I didn't expect you back," she said. Gavin walked closer, stopping at the edge of the yard. "Where's my mother?" Martha hesitated, and that hesitation told him more than the answer. "She left about a week ago," she said slowly. "Said she was going to visit someone." "What someone?" "I don't know. A man. Truck I didn't recognize." "You saw him?" "From a distance. Didn't seem like trouble." Gavin let that sit for a second. "And you didn't call anyone?" "She said she'd be back in a few days," Martha replied, her voice tightening slightly. "Your mother's always been independent. I didn't think—" She stopped. Gavin nodded once, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. "I'm calling the sheriff." Later that afternoon, Sheriff Dale Rourke stood inside the house, flipping through a small notepad. He was a broad, heavy-set man in his early 50s, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his face lined from years of routine work rather than crisis. His eyes were practical, trained to look for simple explanations first, to assume normal before considering anything darker. "No forced entry," Rourke said. "No signs of a struggle." "She's 74, Gavin replied, "still capable of leaving on her own." Gavin didn't move. "I'll file a report," Rourke continued. "We'll check nearby counties, hospitals, shelters, but right now, there's nothing here that suggests a crime." Nothing here. Gavin's eyes shifted toward the window again. Coda stood there, unmoving, staring into the forest like it held something that hadn't come back. That night, the house felt wrong in a way Gavin couldn't explain. He sat in the dark living room, elbows resting on his knees, his thoughts circling back to the same point over and over again. 3 weeks. That was the last time he heard her voice. Not a goodbye, not a warning, just something ordinary that he had never finished. He should have called again. He should have noticed something. But he hadn't, and now the silence felt like something he had helped create. Coda lay near the door, head raised, ears alert, not waiting but holding on to something unseen. Gavin looked toward the window, where the darkness of the forest pressed close against the glass, and for the first time since stepping into the house, he stopped believing this was a simple disappearance. "If I don't go looking," he said quietly, "no one will." Coda didn't move, but his eyes never left the tree. The wind carried dust across an empty highway. The sky stretched wide and pale, as if the world itself had forgotten where it was going. Gavin Mercer left Red Hollow 3 days after filing the report. Not because the sheriff told him to wait, but because waiting felt like surrender. And surrender was something he had trained his entire life to resist. He packed only what mattered: clothes, a few documents, a worn photograph of his mother taken years ago by the lake, and Koda's leash, though he rarely used it. The rest he left behind, including the version of himself that believed someone else would fix this. The first weeks were methodical, almost clinical. Gavin moved like he used to in the field, mapping locations, tracking patterns, turning emotion into structure. He began with a radius around Red Hollow, driving through nearby counties, stopping at gas stations, roadside diners, small-town clinics, places where people noticed strangers but didn't always ask questions. Every stop followed the same routine. He walked in, placed the photograph on the counter, and asked in a voice that stayed level no matter how many times he repeated the same question. "Have you seen her?" Most people hadn't. Some looked longer than others. A few tried to help. Most just shook their heads with quiet sympathy. It didn't matter. Gavin kept moving. Within a week, he printed the first batch of flyers. Cheap paper, black ink, a clear photo of Helen Mercer, her name, her age, a short description, and a phone number that he checked more often than he admitted to himself. He posted them everywhere, on bulletin boards, telephone poles, outside grocery stores, inside laundromats, near bus stops where people drifted in and out without leaving records behind. The flyers became part of his routine, a repetitive act that required no thought, only persistence. Tape, press, smooth the edges, step back, move on. Over time, the flyers began to change. Rain blurred the ink. Sun faded the image. Wind tore corners loose until the paper curled away from the surface it was meant to cling to. New notices covered old ones: yard sales, lost pets, local events, layer by layer, until his mother's face became just another piece of noise in a world full of things people forgot to care about. But Gavin kept printing them, because as long as her face existed somewhere in public, she wasn't gone. Months passed that way, measured not by days, but by distance. Colorado became New Mexico, then Arizona, then stretches of land so empty they barely felt like part of a country at all. He slept in his truck more often than in rooms, ate whatever was available, and worked when he had to. Odd jobs, short contracts, anything that gave him enough money to keep moving. Construction sites, warehouse shifts, overnight security work. His body adapted easily. It always had. What didn't adapt was the silence. At night, when the road went quiet and there was nothing left to do, the same thought returned. 3 weeks. That gap before she disappeared. That window where something might have already been wrong. He replayed their last conversation over and over again, searching for something he had missed, something small that might explain everything now. But memory wasn't precise. It softened edges, erased details, left him with impressions instead of answers. Koda changed too. In the early days, the dog had still carried a kind of restless urgency, as if expecting something to resolve itself quickly. He stayed close to Gavin, watched every movement, reacted to unfamiliar places with alert tension. But then, about 10 days into the search, Koda disappeared. It happened just before dawn at a roadside rest stop in northern New Mexico. Gavin had stepped away for less than a minute, and when he turned back, the dog was gone. There was no sound, no sign of struggle, no clear direction to follow. Gavin searched for hours, then days. He tracked footprints until they vanished into rocky ground, called out until his voice gave out, walked miles into open land where there was nothing but wind and heat. He didn't sleep, didn't stop, didn't allow himself to consider the possibility that he had lost the only thing that still connected him to his mother. On the 6th day, Koda came back. The dog appeared at the edge of a dry field near sunset, moving slower than Gavin had ever seen him, his body low, his coat dulled by dust and dirt. There were shallow cuts along his legs, one ear nicked, his breathing uneven from exhaustion. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just walked straight toward Gavin and stopped. Gavin dropped to one knee without thinking. "Where did you go?" His voice was rough, more emotion in it than he intended to show. Coda didn't answer, of course, but he leaned forward slightly, pressing his head into Gavin's chest for a brief second before pulling back. Then he turned his head. North, always north. That was the only direction that mattered to him. From that moment on, Coda never left Gavin's side again. Not at gas stations, not at rest stops, not anywhere. But sometimes, without warning, the dog would stop, lift his head, and stare into the distance as if something invisible was pulling at him. Gavin stopped asking what it meant. He already knew. 6 months into the search, the call came. Sheriff Rourke's voice sounded exactly the same as it had the day they filed the report. Steady, practical, already halfway to moving on. "We're closing the case, Gavin. No new leads, no activity on her records. At this point, there's nothing more we can do." Gavin stood outside a small grocery store in rural Arizona, the phone pressed against his ear, his eyes fixed on a faded flyer taped to a window. His mother's face stared back at him, already sun-bleached and peeling at the edges. "So that's it?" he asked. "For now," Rourke replied. "If something turns up, we'll reopen it." Something turns up. Gavin ended the call without saying goodbye. He stood there for a long time, staring at the paper, at the way the edges had begun to curl away from the glass, as if even the tape had stopped holding. Most people would have stopped then. That was the moment the system told them to stop, the moment the search officially ended, even if no one said it out loud. Gavin just reached into his bag, pulled out another flyer, and taped it directly over the old one. Same face, same name, same question. "Have you seen her?" A woman stepped out of the store behind him, pausing briefly as she glanced at the flyer. She was in her early 40s, average height, with sun-browned skin and dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her eyes lingered on the image for a second longer than most people's did. "I haven't seen her," she said quietly, "but I hope you find her." Gavin nodded once. "Me too." But hope wasn't what kept him moving anymore. That night, he sat in the back of his truck, the desert air cooling rapidly as the sun disappeared. Coda lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. The world stretched out in every direction, empty and indifferent, offering no answers, no signs, no guarantees. Gavin leaned his head back against the metal frame and closed his eyes for a moment. He understood something now that he hadn't allowed himself to accept before. This wasn't a search with an end date. There was no timeline, no certainty, only the road. He reached down absently, his hand resting against Coda's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. "I'm not stopping," he said quietly. Coda didn't move, but his ears shifted slightly, and after a moment, he lifted his head again, looking into the distance. The late afternoon sun pressed heavily over Dustfall, heat rising from cracked pavement as dust drifted through the market in slow, restless currents. 2 years had stripped Gavin Mercer down to something harder and quieter than the man who first left Red Hollow. At 6'1", he still carried the solid frame of a former United States Marine, broad shoulders and controlled movements shaped by discipline rather than ease. But time had left its mark. A rough beard now edged his sharp jaw, his short dark hair threaded with gray, and his blue-gray eyes no longer searched with urgency. They endured, steady and unyielding, like a man who had learned that hope could disappear, but refusal did not have to. He moved through the crowded market with the same deliberate awareness he once used in hostile territory, one hand holding a worn flyer, the other close enough to Coda to feel the presence of the dog without looking. Coda walked beside him in silence, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a powerful, balanced build. His black and tan coat dulled slightly by years on the road, a faint scar along his front leg, amber eyes alert and constantly scanning. There was no hesitation in him, no confusion, only a quiet, persistent focus that had never faded, not even after everything they had failed to find. Gavin stopped at another stall, placed the flyer down, The same motion repeated hundreds of times, his voice even, controlled. "Have you seen her?" The vendor shook his head without interest. Gavin nodded once, took the paper back, turned. Coda stopped. Not gradually, not uncertainly, completely. His body locked mid-step, muscles tightening beneath his coat, ears snapping forward as his head turned sharply towards something deeper in the market. Gavin felt it instantly, that familiar shift in the air, the same instinct that had kept him alive long before this search began. "Coda." No response. Then the dog moved. Fast. He surged forward with sudden force, weaving through the crowd with precision, brushing past bodies without aggression, but without hesitation, as if drawn by something too strong to ignore. Gavin followed immediately, his pace quickening, tension rising in his chest. "Coda!" The noise of the market blurred as they pushed through, voices fading behind them until Coda slowed near a shaded edge beside a crumbling wall and stopped. There, on the ground, sat a woman. At first glance, she looked like someone the world had already erased. Thin to the point of fragility, wrapped in layers of worn, dust-stained clothing, fabric torn and faded beyond recognition. Her posture curved inward, as if she had spent too long trying to make herself smaller. Her hair hung loose and uneven around her face, once brown but now streaked with gray and dirt, and her skin, pale beneath the grime, carried fine lines shaped by more than age, something harsher, something that had worn her down slowly. But it was her eyes that held Gavin. They were not empty, they were distant. Like she was present in body, but her mind lived somewhere else entirely. Gavin slowed. Coda didn't. The dog stepped forward the final few feet and lowered himself beside her, slowly, deliberately, pressing his body close in a way Gavin had never seen before. Not guarding, not alert, just staying. "Coda," Gavin said again, quieter now. The woman didn't react at first, then slowly she turned. Her gaze settled on the dog. A long pause stretched between them. Her fingers shifted slightly against her lap, almost imperceptible. Her lips parted, dry, uncertain. "Coda?" The name landed like a shockwave. Gavin's chest tightened so sharply it stole his breath for a second. He didn't move, didn't blink. The sound was faint, fragile, but exact. Not close, not mistaken. Exact. "That's not possible," he murmured, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. His hand moved automatically, pulling the old flyer from his pocket, the same one he had carried across 2 years, across states, across seasons. The paper was worn now, edges softened, the image faded just enough to remind him how long it had been. He crouched slowly, his eyes fixed on her face, searching past the dirt, past the exhaustion, past everything that didn't match. "Look at this," he said, his voice steady only because he forced it to be. He held the paper out. She looked, and this time, she didn't look away. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Her brow tightened, not in confusion, not in recognition, but in effort, like something buried was pushing upward, pressing against a wall it could not break. Her breathing shifted slightly. Her fingers curled faintly against her palm. She leaned forward just a fraction, her gaze sharpening for a brief, fragile moment. She whispered. The sound caught, stopped. Her eyes flickered. For one heartbeat, just one, Gavin saw something change. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. A trace of awareness, a shadow of memory trying to form. Then it slipped. Gone. Her gaze drifted again, unfocused, distant, like whatever had almost surfaced had been pulled back into the dark. The moment collapsed. Gavin stayed still, his mind racing, every instinct fighting between belief and restraint. 2 years had taught him the danger of false hope, the cost of seeing meaning where there was none. He had followed too many wrong turns, trusted too many moments that dissolved into nothing. But Coda hadn't moved, not even slightly. The dog remained beside her, calm, grounded, his body pressed close as if this was the only place he intended to be. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed in a way Gavin had not seen in months. No tension, no hesitation, only certainty. Gavin swallowed, his voice lower now, almost careful. "Who are you?" No answer. The woman stared past him again, her expression unchanged, disconnected. Around them, the market slowly returned. Footsteps, voices, life continuing without pause. But Gavin remained where he was. Because for the first time in 2 years, something had changed. This wasn't another face, wasn't another dead end. It was something closer, something dangerous in a different way. He looked down at Coda, then back at the woman, his grip tightening slightly on the flyer. A memory surfaced without warning. His mother standing in the doorway years ago, one hand resting on Coda's head, her voice steady as she told him to come back safe. The image felt distant now, almost unreal, like something from another life. The woman in front of him looked nothing like that memory. And yet, Coda had not hesitated, not for a second. Gavin exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling into something heavier than doubt. After 2 years of chasing shadows, this was the first time one had stopped running, and he didn't know yet if that made it real or just something he wasn't ready to lose. Morning settled over Dustfall General in a pale, filtered hush, the kind of light that made even clean walls look tired. Gavin stood beside the hospital bed with his notebook open, not because writing things down made them easier to bear, but because he had spent 2 years learning that memory failed, details shifted, and grief lied if you let it speak for too long without being pinned to paper. His mother sat propped against the pillows, washed clean now, wrapped in a hospital gown that made her look smaller than she ever had in his memory. The sharpest part of the shock was not how much she had changed, but how much of her had survived underneath it. Her hands still moved through Coda's fur in that slow, absent rhythm he remembered from childhood evenings, when she used to sit on the porch and calm every living thing around her without trying. That same hand had the thin, old scar at the wrist, pale and certain as scripture. It was her. He knew it now with the kind of certainty that didn't need comfort. What he did not know was how much of her was still reachable, or how much had been left scattered somewhere between a cabin in the woods and 2 years of walking through a country that had never once asked her name hard enough to keep it. Coda lay pressed against the side of the bed, still and watchful, his broad black and tan body relaxed only in the way a dog relaxes when he has finally found what he was meant to protect. He did not sleep. Every time Helen's breathing shifted, his ears twitched. Every time she moved her hand, his eyes lifted to her face. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and laundry soap, but beneath it all, Gavin could still feel the road on himself, dust and old coffee and the dry ache of too many miles. He had not left the hospital except to speak with staff and splash water on his face in a restroom mirror that showed him a stranger made harder by waiting. Dr. Elena Ruiz came in just after sunrise, carrying a tablet and a paper cup of coffee she had probably forgotten to drink. She was composed in the precise way of someone who had seen panic enough times to stop being impressed by it. Dark hair pinned back, voice low, eyes attentive without becoming soft. She had the kind of face that people trusted before they meant to, not because it was warm, but because it was honest. She slept some, Dr. Ruiz said, glancing from Helen to Gavin. That helps. Her recall may come in flashes. Don't force chronology if she can't hold it. Gavin nodded once. I only need what she can give. Ruiz studied him for a second, as if deciding whether he understood the difference between information and harm. Then ask for images, she said, not explanations. When she left, Gavin pulled the chair closer and sat. He kept his voice low, not gentle exactly, but stripped of command. Can you tell me the first thing you remember clearly? Helen did not answer at once. Her eyes stayed on Coda's fur. When she spoke, the words came like objects lifted one by one from dark water. Cold wood. He wrote it down. Inside or outside? Inside. What else? A smell. She frowned. Oil. Wet clothes. Old coffee. Gavin's pen moved faster. Do you remember windows? 1. Could you see out? She nodded faintly. Trees. Sometimes water. That tightened something in him. Water close by? I think so. Her fingers paused in Coda's fur. The dog lifted his head but did not move. "Did you hear it?" "No." A small shake of her head. "Not water. Wood." She pressed her fingers to her temple. Something, hitting wood. Slow, again and again. Gavin looked up. Dock, loose plank, rope against post. Something lakeside, not deep forest. He wrote all of it. "Do you remember the man?" That changed the room. Helen's breathing shortened. Her eyes shifted away from him. "Yes." "What do you remember?" "Tall, a swallow. Thin, beard. Quiet." "Did he shout?" "No." That answer was immediate. "Did he threaten you?" She closed her eyes, and he thought for a second she would stop there, retreating into the fog again. But then she said very softly, "He spoke like things were already decided." Gavin stared at the page. "He told you what to do?" "Yes." "Did he touch you?" "A beat." "Sometimes. Guiding. Not hurting." Her mouth tightened. "That was worse." Gavin let the silence stretch. He understood that kind of control. No bruises to point at, no dramatic violence, just a system built around removing choice until obedience looked almost voluntary from the outside. "How did you get there?" "I don't know." "Do you remember leaving home?" Her eyes opened wider, unfocused but straining. "A truck," she whispered. "Green, loud engine, bench seat." Then, with a flash of shame that should never have belonged to her, "I thought I was helping." Gavin felt his jaw harden. "Helping with what?" "I can't." She pressed her fingertips harder to her forehead. "Paperwork. Maybe. Something about the house. About signatures." Her voice thinned. He talked like he knew things. That was enough for him to understand the shape of it. Not force at first. Access. Familiarity. Information gathered from somewhere. A man who knew how to make an elderly woman feel confused and slightly embarrassed for not understanding until stepping into his truck felt easier than asking a second question. "Do you remember escaping?" This time Coda stood up. Helen's hand remained tangled in his fur as if she needed the dog to keep the memory from breaking apart. "Night," she said. "I waited until he slept, or I thought he slept." Her breathing turned shallow. "I opened the door. I ran downhill. There were rocks." She touched the side of her head again, more firmly now. "I fell. I remember the ground. I remember blood in my eye." Her voice dropped. "After that, I knew I was afraid, but I didn't know of what." Gavin wrote the sentence exactly. "I knew I was afraid, but I didn't know of what." That was the whole tragedy of it. The fear remained after the facts had been stripped away. Sheriff Daniel Cross arrived less than an hour later with a thin county file and the patient heaviness of a man who had spent years around unfinished business. He was broad through the chest and middle, beard clipped close, face weathered by sun and long drives, with the habit of listening all the way through before deciding whether to speak. Gavin met him in the corridor outside the room and handed over the notebook without preamble. Cross read in silence, thumb holding the pages flat. "Cabin near trees and water," Cross said at last. "Green pickup. Quiet mail. Coercive control. Elder target." Gavin said the name before the sheriff could. "Derek Shaw." Cross looked up. "You know it." "I know the pattern." Cross gave a short nod. "He's used aliases in 3 states. Fraud complaints. Property scams. Targeting older women living alone. Never enough for a clean prosecution." He tapped the notebook once. "This is the first time I've seen his shape this clearly." Gavin took the notebook back. "So now what?" Cross's expression hardened by a degree. "Now we start turning fragments into evidence." Gavin looked through the small glass pane in the door. Helen sat on the bed with Coda leaning against her leg, not whole, not safe yet, but present. For the first time in 2 years, the story in front of him was no longer only loss. It had structure now, a man, a method, a vehicle, a place near woods and water. Derek Shaw had spent years moving through quiet lives because he understood how easily isolation could erase a victim. What he had not understood was that this time one of them had come back, and a son who had spent 2 years refusing to stop was finally close enough to stop searching and start closing in. The road out of Dustfall cut through low hills and thinning pine. The sky stretched wide and colorless above them, as if the world itself had paused to watch what came next. Gavin sat in the passenger seat of the sheriff's truck, his notebook resting closed in his lap for the first time in 2 years, not because he no longer needed it, but because the pieces inside it had finally begun to form something that moved on its own. Sheriff Cross drove in silence, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the radio, his posture relaxed but alert in the way of a man who understood that the moment before action was often quieter than anything that came after. Coda lay in the back seat, head low but eyes open, tracking every shift in motion, every change in direction, as if he already knew they were not searching anymore, they were closing in. They reached the first location just past noon, a stretch of forest that matched Helen's fragmented memory with unsettling precision. The trees stood dense and uneven, their trunks darkened by moisture, and the air carried that faint mix of damp wood and something older, something stagnant that did not belong to open land. The cabin revealed itself slowly as they approached, not abandoned in the obvious sense, but left in a way that suggested it had been used recently and then discarded without care. Weathered planks, a single narrow window, a door that hung slightly off alignment. Gavin stepped out before the engine fully died, his boots hitting the ground with a weight that came from something deeper than urgency. Coda moved ahead of him, nose low, body tense, the same silent focus he had carried for 2 years now sharpening into something almost precise. "This is it," Cross said, not as a question. Gavin didn't answer, he didn't need to. Inside, the cabin smelled exactly as Helen had described: oil, damp fabric, stale coffee that had soaked into the wood itself. It was the kind of smell that didn't disappear, no matter how long the place sat empty. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a metal chair beside a rough wooden table, and near the window, faint marks scratched into the surface of the wood, as if someone had needed to count time but had no way to measure it. Gavin's eyes moved slowly across the space, not searching anymore, but confirming. Every detail his mother had given him was here, not exaggerated, not distorted, real. Coda stopped near the far corner, pawing once at the floorboards before letting out a low, controlled growl, not loud enough to alarm, but deep enough to carry meaning. There had been someone here, recently. Cross stepped outside and spoke into the radio, his voice measured. "We've got a confirmed site, matches victim statement. Possible recent activity. Notify state." The response crackled back, sharp and immediate. This was no longer a quiet case lost in paperwork. This was something active again. The next step came faster than Gavin expected. Records tied to Derek Shaw, thin and scattered before, began to align when seen through the lens of Helen's account. The green pickup, the isolated properties, the pattern of moving just before attention could settle. It wasn't one place, it was a chain. Temporary locations, each used long enough to serve a purpose, then abandoned before questions formed. But patterns always left gaps, and this time, those gaps were enough. They tracked him 2 counties over. The motel sat near a highway that cut through open land, the kind of place where people came and went without being remembered. The paint on the building had faded unevenly, the neon sign flickering despite the daylight, and the parking lot held only a handful of vehicles, none of them new. Gavin stepped out of the truck and felt that same shift settle into his chest, the quiet that came right before everything moved. Coda stood beside him, still but coiled, every muscle ready. "You stay behind us," Cross said. Gavin didn't argue, but he didn't step back either. Deputies moved into position with the efficiency of routine, but there was tension in it now, a recognition that this man had slipped through systems before. The door to the room was closed, no sound from inside. Cross knocked once, firm. "Sheriff's office." Silence. He knocked again. "Derek Shaw, open the door." For a second, nothing changed. Then a faint movement inside, something quick, something reactive. Cross didn't wait for a third knock. The door gave under pressure, swinging inward with a sharp crack that split the quiet open. Derek Shaw stood near the far wall, not surprised, not in the way most men would be. He was thinner than Gavin expected, his frame narrow, shoulders slightly hunched as if conserving space rather than claiming it. His beard was uneven, streaked with gray, and his eyes carried that unsettling calm Helen had described, the look of someone who believed control was something he could rebuild no matter how many times it was taken from him. For a brief moment he didn't move, he simply looked at them, measuring. "You took your time," Derek said. Cross stepped forward. "It's over." Derek's gaze shifted, landing on Gavin for just a fraction longer than necessary. There was recognition there, not of the man, but of the role, the son. The one thing his system had never accounted for. "She walked out," Derek said, almost casually. "I didn't stop her." Gavin's voice came low, controlled. "You made sure she couldn't find her way back." For the first time, something in Derek's expression shifted, not guilt, not fear, but irritation. As if the truth, spoken plainly, was an inconvenience. The arrest itself was clean, no struggle, no sudden violence. Just the slow collapse of a system that had relied on silence and isolation. Handcuffs closed around Derek's wrist, and whatever control he believed he had maintained disappeared with a finality that did not need to be spoken. By the time they returned to Dustfall, the light had softened into evening. The hospital room felt different now, not because anything inside it had changed, but because something outside it finally had. Helen sat by the window, her posture steadier, her eyes clearer, though still carrying that distance that would take time to close. Gavin stepped inside and stopped just short of the bed, not rushing, not forcing anything forward. "I found him," he said. She looked at him, really looked this time, as if aligning the voice with something deeper. "Gavin," she said, the name fragile but certain. It wasn't everything, it wasn't full memory, not yet, but it was enough. Weeks later, back in Red Hollow, the house stood exactly as he had left it, quiet, unchanged, waiting in that same patient way it always had. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped up, the wood familiar beneath his boots. Coda moved ahead of him, slower now, not searching, not tracking, just returning. He lay down near the edge of the porch, facing the road, his posture relaxed for the first time in a way that carried no tension beneath it. Inside, Helen moved carefully through the space, her hand brushing against walls, furniture, objects that held memory in ways her mind was still relearning. She paused near the doorway, looking out toward the porch where Coda rested. "He stayed," she said quietly. Gavin nodded. "He always does." There was no need to explain time or distance or the years that had stretched between loss and return. Coda didn't understand those things. He never had. He only understood presence. And now, as the light faded over Red Hollow and the silence settled again, not empty this time, but complete, everything he had been waiting for was finally there. Miracles don't always come suddenly. They come through faith, patience, and the strength to keep going when everything feels lost. Gavin didn't find his mother by chance, but by refusing to give up, even after years of silence and uncertainty. God may not remove the darkness right away, but He walks with you through it. Every step you take, every moment you endure, is part of something bigger, even when you can't see it yet. And sometimes, the longest journeys lead to the most meaningful reunions. In your own life, if you're facing something heavy right now, don't stop. Hold on a little longer. Because the moment you're ready to give up might be the moment everything is about to change. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support truly makes a difference. May God bless you, watch over your family, and guide your path through every challenge